Hello, everyone. Welcome, Bloom, Colt, Justin. Okay, so I have a few thoughts on Nightreign's lore, so I'll kind of go through them and see where we end up. So, to start off, I think there's first the question of whether this is canonical to the base game. And I think this is sort of a matter of interpretation, what you mean by canonical. The analogy that I've been thinking of is if you imagine that you have been playing a D&D session with a group of friends, and let's say you're the dungeon master. You've been playing this one adventure for months and months and months, right? You've created this intricate world, right? And then um, that adventure sort of concludes, but the rest of your friends want to continue with that world. They want to create a new adventure, and you can't make it. You just can't make these sessions anymore. So they're going to continue with this world and create a new adventure in it. So would you say that that is canonical to your original story? If they were a part of it, they were a part of that original story, but you're not there anymore. You're not the dungeon master. You've handed the reins to someone else. Um, or you can think of a lot of other examples, analogies for this. It's an elaboration of it's not fan fiction because this is coming from the people that were involved in the original world. So, um, the, whether you want to say it's canonical or not, um, it's definitely not the same thing as just someone randomly coming along and adding to the lore. And there's enough in the game that seems relevant to the base game that I'm not going to dismiss it. Now, there's definitely certain things which, I'm not going to look too closely at, um, trying to, for example, connect the Dark Souls universe. Um, but and I wouldn't look too deeply into, for example, the locations of certain enemies, like which enemies appear on top of the castle. Does this have something to do with the history of Limgrave? This is not worth exploring, in my view. But there are certain things which seem very relevant to the base game. So whether you want to say it's canonical or whether it's just a separate story, um, I think it's interesting to explore. So, okay, so I'm gonna start by let's see if this pops up. Okay, so the first thing with any story, of course, is setting. So, where are we and when are we? Um, when is in a way a little bit easier to answer. When this is essentially a direct sequel to Elden Ring. This happens after the events of the base game, after the well, okay, this gets a little bit confusing already, but after it is after the time period in which the base game takes place. However, we're dealing with multiple timelines and multiple different sort of dimensions. And this is not just multiple timelines in the sense of um, this is a what if scenario, which is true, but also this is diegetic to the world, right? So the multiple timelines thing, this is part of actually the lore of Nightreign. So the way I've sort of constructed my metaphysical understanding of this world is we can imagine that the universe looks something like, well, I don't even know how to use paint. It's been so long. Hold on. How do I get a bigger size? Bigger size. Where is something? Do, 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 do. Okay, this is fine. We'll just zoom in. So the universe would look something like this. Okay, so each of these, oops. Let's make sure that these are all closed. Excuse my poor drawing skills, but basically what we've got going on here is this is just sort of formless chaos, formlessness. There's nothing really going on here, and what we have here are little microcosms. These are each their own world. Da, da, da. How do I have both brooches? I don't actually have them, but if you use the sign board, the sigil board to switch it out, you'll get both of them, both of the descriptions, both versions in your relic thing. So you can only have one that you can equip, but you can see both of them. Okay, so this is basically how I'm imagining the sort of multiverse of Elden Ring's world. And when I say multiverse, I'm not necessarily saying that Dark Souls, that this is some grand, MCU like thing. I'm just talking about Elden Ring here. I'll get to the Dark Souls stuff in a moment, but um, basically we have chaos, formlessness. Not chaos like the frenzied flame necessarily, although I think it's related, but this is just formless. This is like, in the Greek myths, everything starts with chaos. Chaos is a Greek word. That's literally the origin. And then sort of everything emerges from that. And there's a lot of myths, the Sumerian myths, sort of the primordial waters. So it's usually thought of um, as being something water-like, this sort of initial background of the world. Not a void exactly, because a void sort of implies the absence of anything, whereas I think this is more like, you could maybe think of it as a void, but I think it's more like potential. So it's just chaos, it's formlessness, there's no shape to anything. Because in order to have form, you need light. And so light gives something form, and that's how you have these little bubbles. And these bubbles would be a whole world in there. So we could call this, for example, World A. Okay. World A is where everything in Elden Ring happens, basically. Let's say up until the Shattering. So this would be all of the stuff to do with America's rise to power, the Hornsent, all the ancient dragons, Farum Azula, the ancient dynasty, Rao, all of this stuff is going on inside this world. Volume is very low. Let me see if I can up that. Is that any better at all, or is that about the same? I've had a consistent problem with my microphone setup, so I do need to look at this at some point to figure out why it is never loud enough. Let me just read your comments very quickly. DS2 wasn't technically canon at first, even though it was built on DS1 lore. Also, those same devs were involved in the making of DS1. Miyazaki incorporated DS2 into the lore of Dark Souls, so it is canon. Yes. Yeah, that's actually a pretty good analogy. DS2 was not, did not involve Miyazaki, at least not, he was minorly involved, sort of like Nightreign. Miyazaki was consulted at the beginning of Nightreign. We don't know if he was consulted on the lore or not, but yeah, so that's a pretty good analogy. If you consider DS2 canon to the Dark Souls story, is that only because of Dark Souls 3? Or is it just on its own? If you imagine there was no Dark Souls 3, would you consider DS2 canon to Dark Souls? Sort of, it all depends on your interpretation of what is canon. Okay, so will I be going into detail on any of the remembrances? Yes. Yeah, this is full spoilers for all of the Nightreign story, so if you have not completed this stuff, I will be talking about them. So, fair warning. The interview states that only the events of the Shattering happens in this game. Anything post that doesn't necessarily have happened. I think, well, I'll explain how I think this is, how this all works. Because I think in Nightreign's story, okay, well, let me just continue with this whole explanation, and then I think you tell me if you think this makes sense. So, oh, hello, Cecilia. What's going on here? We're talking about Nightreign lore. Okay, so here we have formless chaos. This is the background of the multiverse. And in order, of course, it's formless because in darkness, there is no form. In order to have form, you need light because light shows you how something is shaped. So light is the thing that gives something form, and that's how you get a world. Now, in this world, this is where all the stuff in ER happens. And then let's say in this little bubble world over here, here's the, oops, here's the Nightreign stuff. Okay? And, over here, we could say there's just, oh, I can't spell. Something else. There's just something else going on over there. Okay. Now, the thing is, the lands between, and by the way, I'm not saying this is facts. I'm just saying this is how I'm sort of conceptualizing the universe. So this is definitely speculation. I'm sort of basing this off of certain things in the game, but this is not by no means definitive. So the lands between is a kind of nexus. And there we have a little Erd tree, let's say, in there. The lands between is a kind of nexus where it's sort of not it exists, let's say, in world A, but it also kind of exists everywhere because these are all related worlds. Now, okay, you might ask why I'm even coming up with this convoluted explanation for the different multiverse thing. So we know in the base game of Elden Ring that the Round Table Hold exists outside of this world. It's said explicitly. So there's something going on with this doesn't quite exist in World A, right? Round Table Hold. Round Table Hold. Okay. Then we also have Everjails. They're kind of pocket dimensions. What's going on there? But they're just dark. It's the same place, but not the same place. So we have multiple, and then we have things like, for example, the Elden Beast arena, where we see a bunch of Erdtree trunks. What's going on there? There's another place that's kind of not physically connected exactly to World A, whatever World A is. So we already have this concept of multiple sort of simultaneous realities. Then we have phantoms. So while I'm exploring, here's me, a tarnished. I'm in World A. But someone who's also exploring World A invades me. Well, who are they? They're also a tarnished. How are we both in the same thing? They've defeated, let's say, 3 shard bearers in their world. I've only defeated 1. This doesn't make any sense. That's because this guy is from World A1. He's from another version of whatever this world is. So we have multiple realities going on. Now, I think this is much clearer actually in Nightreign, because in Nightreign we have, here's the Round Table Hold. This is the hub that we're actually in most of the time, right? Here's where the Iron Menial is, where all the Nightfarers are, etc. Okay, then we take a this is a hawk. Let's make a little picture of a hawk. This is us being transported from the Round Table Hold to Limveld, sorry. Okay, so how do we get there exactly? It's on the ocean, and I think the ocean is sort of, it isn't exactly this formless chaos, but it is something like it. Water is a barrier, but it's not a barrier. It's a liminal state in between things. So traversing the sea is not too far off from sort of traversing between different worlds. So when we go from the Round Table Hold to Limveld, we're not just traversing physical space, I don't think. That's why we take a Spirit Hawk. Because this place is not really a physical place exactly. And the reason we know that is because the Iron Menial tells us that outside somewhere else, there is a wilder who is dying. This looks so bad. Hold on. Let me just give him little X eyes. That's Wilder. Okay, so Wilder is dying in the outside world. But Wilder is also here at the round table. How does that work? So this round table, just like in the base game, round table hold, is not exactly in the world. It's in a sort of pocket dimension, let's say. So then we could ask, is Limfeld also connected to this world, or is it in its own separate place? And I think it is in its own separate place. Now, another reason that we have to suppose that we've got multiple different realities going on is because there are multiple Night Lords. So we first have Helster. There he is with his 3 arms. That's a dagger. So there's Helstor. And he's the aspect of night. He's sort of the one, let's say, responsible for this current night. But we also have these 7 other guys. They each have their own night. So how does that make any sense? We all, we access them. They're all sort of in the same arena, although the skybox changes. We all access them from Limfeld through the Divine Tower tree. But it's not as if there's multiple Night Lords who are all just they're working together. They all have their own night. So when we look at the relics for these things, let's see. Let's go back to this. So when you look at the relics, hold on, I need to actually zoom in on this so I can see myself. It says for each of them the knight belonging to Gladius, the knight belonging to Adele, the knight belonging to Fulgor, right? So each of these guys, they have their own knight. And that's because the knight is essentially more of this stuff, formlessness. So it allows for multiple different realities to exist. So each of these Night Lords, they all, let's call this, let's say Roundtable Hold. This is, let's make this clear. Roundtable Hold exists in one world. We'll call it World 1. Limveld. The Limveld with Hellstore is World 2. Then each of these is World 3, 4, 5, etc. Right? Each of these is its own sort of reality, even though they're all connected, of course, because they are all accessed by Limfeld. But this is why, for example, you have the shifting Earth. So, and Limfeld is never the same every time you play it, right? There's different versions of Limfeld because it's not it's not the same Limveld. So actually, when you go and you fight one of these bosses, you travel from the Round Table Hold. The Round Table Hold is always the same because this is a special little pocket dimension that's been created for this purpose of getting rid of the night. Um, when you go to Limfeld, you're going to one of many, many different Limfelds. Maybe there's 100, maybe 500, maybe an infinite amount. And some of these are controlled by, let's say, Gladius. Some of them are some of them are the worlds where the Night Lord is Gladius. Some of them are the worlds where the Night Lord is Hellster, right? And I think whenever you go and do the Hellster one, it's all like the trees are all dying, right? It looks a little bit different. And sometimes you get the shifting earth, and that also changes things. So this is basically my picture of the sort of overall metaphysics of the world. We definitely are dealing with multiple realities. I think this is very explicit, actually, as far as the Wilder thing goes, because we have multiple Wilders. So the Wilder that exists in the Round Table Hold is not the same as the Wilder that exists in the outside world. So let me just read your comments. I was thinking the Nexus is what the Elden Beast summons when it roars, the arena where you can see multiple Erdtrees. Yeah, I think that is basically what that is meant to represent. This is something that FromSoft has done frequently. For example, Ash Lake or the Hunter's Dream, you see these pillars that sort of symbolize this nexus point where there's multiple different versions of the same place. I mean, this is actually the one thing to understand about FromSoft, I think, is that a lot of the lore comes from a basic principle, which is that Miyazaki has talked about, which is story for game rather than game for story. So the story develops from the game that they're designing, like game mechanics that they're designing. But he wants to make it as immersive an adventure as possible. So you have these contrivances in game design that are generally just, in most games, you just sort of ignore them. So in most games, you die in a game and then you restart at a checkpoint. And canonically in the game, whatever you did in between that checkpoint and dying never happened, right? But in the Souls games, this is canonical because there's this whole world building to explain how you died, and you actually did die. You did this whole thing from the grace to dying, or from the bonfire to dying, and then you came back to life because you're undead in Dark Souls, or you're tarnished in Elden Ring. So the narrative is there to provide context for these mechanics. So you also have a mechanic where multiple people are playing the same game, and you can also enter each other's worlds. And so these are also given narrative context within the world. So, for example, in Dark Souls, you know, the phantoms, this was given some, I mean, it was addressed in a minor way, but, you know, Solaire's famous thing about time is convoluted. This is his explanation. This is their first introduction to the whole multiplayer system, is he says that time is convoluted. And so these, you know, different people can sort of show up in your world. I know there's some translation issues there because in the Japanese, he says something more like time is stagnant. But in any case, the point is that they do actually try and provide some narrative context for how these contrivances happen. They're not meant to just be dismissed as, you know, game contrivances in the way that you would with normal games. In the Souls games, these are meant to be part of the narrative context. So the fact that there are that someone invades your world, this is not just some multiplayer contrivance. This is actually meant to exist. Their world actually exists in this multiverse, and your world actually exists, and you're both tarnished, and you're both defeating the same quote unquote people. Um, and so these parallel, bubble worlds are are intersecting for a moment there. So I'm just reading your comments now. Um, by the way, welcome Ordeal and Fasten Carrot and Saucy and so many people. Um, Justin says all of the Nightfarers are spirits, aren't they? They can run as fast as Torrent and use spirit springs. I feel like the tombs in the crypt are for all of them too. They're all dead, aren't they? Um, I'm sort of avoiding using the word spirit because I think that gets very complicated. And I know in the Discord we've had long-standing, probably multi-year conversations about what exactly spirits are and souls and spirit bodies and so on. And of course there is the Helfin Steeple, which talks about a spirit world. I think I'll sort of avoid answering that exactly, but it Wilder is not dead in the outside world. He is dying, so maybe the X's this is about to happen. Although the timeline might be a little bit confusing here because if you're in different worlds, do they actually occur simultaneously or not? That's a bit uh I don't know. I don't know about that, but I don't think it's exactly that he's not just Wilder's spirit. And also the tomb is not Wilder's tomb inside the Roundtable Hold. So the tombs in the crypt are the ancestors of the Nightfarers. Um, but yeah, I think the point about the Spirit Springs is a good thing to bring up. The fact that they basically work like Torrent. Mm. Iron Eye comments on there being multiple Night Lords, saying, with this many lords vying for the same throne, perhaps they'll do us a favor and wipe each other out or something. I'll look up that line. I don't remember that. But Iron Eye's Remembrance Quest also gives us information about these multiple realities because he actually kills himself. Or another version of he actually kills multiple versions of himself, one in the crypt and one out in Limfeld. And the Night Invaders, that whole thing that happens, that is also you're fighting different versions of the Nightfarers who have been sort of corrupted by the night. Oh, I meant to go back to MS Paint. Sorry. You haven't been looking at my beautiful drawings this whole time. Okay. I don't know if I really had anything to say. I was just sort of circling things. I didn't add anything. So, pocket dimensions. Yeah, like the bubbles Maris draws you into during her invasions. Exactly. Yeah. So Maris, the description. Actually, let me go back to that because the description speaks of. I need to look at this again. Hold on. So, do, do, do. where's this thing about it being makes an ocean of its surrounding? Um, where does that come from? There's something about, oh, maybe it's just this description. Da, 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 there we go. Yeah, it makes an ocean of its surroundings that it may blend with whatever life is found. And obviously, it's like a sort of jellyfish type creature. Um, and so it's meant to give you this impression of aquatic life, right? It has these little jellyfish children that explode. Um, and so there's this whole thing about water, which is basically coming back to this idea of formlessness, the sort of primordial ocean that exists between worlds and that everything kind of spawns from chaos. Chaos in the sense of potential and formlessness, not necessarily chaos as in the burn the Erd tree to the ground type of chaos, although I think basically what the frenzied flame is doing is kind of returning things to this state, but via there's something else going on. Is this string theory? Yeah, I think that is sort of part of the inspiration for this, right? So there is an idea, and this is totally outside of my purview, but that at the very basic level of reality, there's something called quantum foam, and that you have these sort of bubbles that appear in the foam, and that is kind of, I think, I don't know if this is pop science or not, but I have heard the idea that each of these bubbles could sort of contain uh, a different reality based on this sort of quantum state, this quantum superposition thing, where depending on the I'm not going to try and explain. I'm not going to try and explain string theory or quantum theory, but I think there are some similarities. So I had the thought that the primordial Night Lord's rune isn't from the Elden Ring itself, but is its own full ring created by the Night itself. The Night is a being similar to the Greater Will in scale. Yeah, I think as far as the rune goes, runes can exist without the Elden Ring. The Elden Ring is not the source of runes. The Elden Ring was created from the Elden Beast, but obviously runes are a type of language. So, a rune can exist. Yeah, you could draw a rune on a piece of rock and not have it have any particular kind of power necessarily in this world. Now, maybe it would have some kind of power because that's just generally how magical worlds work, but it wouldn't have the same kind of power as the runes that make up the Elden Ring. But you can also replace those runes in the Elden Ring. Other runes can exist outside of that. So it's not as if the Elden Ring is the source of all runes. Rather, I think the Elden Ring is created by forming the Elden Beast into this collection of runes. So the Primordial Night Lord's rune, that's just another rune that exists. Mm-hmm. Extreme Crunchy fully explains quantum theory. I'm not gonna try and do that, but thank you for the super chat. Okay, so this is the basic background sort of reality that we're dealing with. So then I'm gonna go into each of the characters. So let's go back to this. And make sure I can see it. So So each of these characters, um, they are descendants. Why is this so far over? Okay. They are descendants of the people who are in the crypt, and they are condemned. So they are sort of cursed to cursed to be tied to this place until the night is defeated. So one thing about the sort of multiple realities here is that even though there are these different realities with different night lords, it is sort of the night. If you think of the night as being, it's basically this potential. So it is the thing which allows for multiple realities because it's sort of chaotic. And the basic metaphor there being, light gives something form. It's definite. This is why it's always associated with faith and the sort of definitive, the golden order. It's about order. It's about faith. There's one true God, right? There's one way that things exist. And I think this is sort of why the Lands Between maybe exists as a kind of nexus point, because the Erd Tree as this tree of light sort of defines itself within the multiverse in a way that other worlds might not. Light makes something definite, whereas darkness allows for lots of possibilities, right? If you can't quite make something out in the dark, it could be multiple things. Your imagination takes over. So the night allows for all these different things. There is one night that's sort of washing over this whole multiverse layout. But the specific form of the night, the different nights that belong to the Night Lords, these eight Night Lords, they're all sort of different layers, different versions of the night. But it is all one thing. So when you defeat Hellstore, you are actually getting rid of the night. You're not just getting rid of it in one world. You're getting rid of it fully, at least for the moment. And of course, this is FromSoft, so everything is cycles. So of course, this could all happen again. Okay, but so we have the basic setting. So where are we? We're in the Round Table Hold, and let's just travel to the crypt. Why not? So that we can see. So we have this very interesting description here. To atone for the first sin, we elect to become the foundation. So the sin is very clearly referring to the night itself. That the allowance of this night to exist, the people who are responsible for this whole setup with the Round Table Hold and who are now sort of guiding the Nightfarers to defeat the night, were somehow involved in allowing that night to happen in the first place. And so what is their plan? Well, they anticipated the night, and so they set up this thing where these coffins here, the descendants of these people who are sort of implied to be partly to blame for the night. Now, that could be simply because they were sort of around in the world. It could be because these descendants were actually directly involved in helping, let's say, Hellstor or some of these other Night Lords achieve power. There is a good question as to why, for example, the Duchess's pocket watch is in the hands of Gladius. But in any case, these ancestors were, these people were buried here, and then their descendants, because of this, have been sort of trapped in the Round Table Hold, or their spirits, um, their alternate selves, their astral projections, however you want to put it, whatever this Wilder is, this version of Wilder, which is different from the one that exists in the outside world, has been trapped here until they can defeat the Night. And the way this is framed is the ways of cutting point to the deep woods, bestow branches to those who are worthy and wise. And then here it says, ways of cutting point to Windwale Knoll, bestow branches to those who wander and roam. So the ancestors of, in this case, Recluse and Wilder, have been bestowed branches, and that is part of this sort of magic that is keeping these spirits, or these versions of the Nightfarers here, because they've been bestowed branches. And I think the metaphor of branching timelines is a bit too on point to not bring that up. So I think the idea of by whatever this means, bestowing branches, that this allows for, let's say, the spirit of Wilder or some alternate version of Wilder, a branch off of Wilder, to kind of be stuck here in the Round Table Hold, even though the normal version of Wilder is still in the outside world. I think that's basically the idea. So they've used this branching power to get these Nightfarers here, because the Nightfarers can then, they have their own little team of people to try and take down the Night Lord and stop the Night. Shiras says, can you not just say that the Erd Tree is just a tree of timelines, or Yggdrasil? These don't sound like completely different universes, just different timelines. Light is time, right? Yeah, a couple different things there. I think a tree of time is not a bad analogy, although I don't think that's exactly it. I think there is something definitely similar about that. And Yggdrasil, right? Yggdrasil is the Norse tree, which connects the 9 different spheres of existence, which also, in Norse myth, it's sort of odd because they're not, sort of like, I think, what's going on in Elden Ring, they're not fully metaphysically separate in the way that, in a science fiction show, you might think of like a different universe is something that exists concurrently and simultaneously, but just in a different dimension or something. But when you look at ancient myths, there isn't really that sort of concurrence. That never really happens. Mount Olympus is like literally a mountain. These are places that you could physically travel to. And in the Norse myths, you have this connection of, let's say, going from Asgard to Midgard, you have the Brisingamer, the Rainbow Bridge. And so there's this kind of mystical connection there. But it's also actually literally a bridge. And you can travel from Midgard to Jotunheim just on foot. You can travel there in physical space, even though they're kind of different worlds. So there's a kind of ambiguity between what the boundary is between these worlds. And I think basically the ocean in Elden Ring kind of serves the same purpose. You can sail into a different universe, so to speak, and into a different, let's say, timeline or dimension, whatever you want to call it, these little bubbles of reality. But it is a sort of a separate place, but it's also not separate at the same time. And there's a lot of similarities here. I think 2 very important sources of influence that I would use as maybe not support for any of these ideas, but as guidance for these ideas. One would be the Eternal Champion series, particularly the novels concerning Elric of Melniboné. There's one called The Sailor on the Seas of Fate, in which um, I think I've explained this before in a video, but I'll just sort of give you the lowdown again. There's a guy called Michael Moorcock who was an incredibly prolific writer, mostly fantasy, some science fiction, and some other novels. And at a certain point in his output, he decided that he would combine all of his stories together into one big multiverse. Um, and he came up with this idea of the eternal champion, which is that in each of these different universes there is one eternal champion, and the eternal champion is the same person across all of these different universes, even though it's a different person, so to speak. There's John Dacre, and then there's Ericosa, and there's Elric, and there's these different in Hawkmoon, there's all these different characters. They are all the eternal champion, sort of a different version of the eternal champion reflected across time and across universes. Um, and In this whole multiverse series, there's a place called Tanalorn, which is also called the Eternal City, by the way, which is very interesting. But Tanalorn is this kind of nexus, which exists. You could say it exists in multiple realities, or it exists between realities. There's a lot of similarities to the lands between there. And it's this sort of place of respite, an anchor point in the multiverse, and a nexus point. And in The Sailor on the Seas of Fate, for example, Elric gets on a ship, and on that ship are also three other versions of the Eternal Champion, three other versions of himself, and they sort of travel between worlds just by going on the ocean, because the ocean is this sort of pathway. It's something liminal, and so that allows you to kind of, water and mist and fog and these sorts of things are always liminal places that kind of the boundaries between realities start to fray. That's why, fog is a classic one in the Souls games. The fog doors, it's the colorless fog in Demon Souls, is literally sort of reality coming apart because people don't have souls, because so they don't have clarity, and so without clarity you can't actually see anything. But that also means that reality itself starts to come apart. Anyway, so where are we next? So, okay, bestowing branches. So we've got this tribe, the Cutting Gifted tribe, which I'll get to in a second. So the Cutting Gifted tribe takes these 8 people, and inters them in this crypt. And the purpose of this is so that the descendants of the people interred in this crypt will, the branches here, there's some kind of magic that will cause the descendants of these people to sort of split, so that their spirits, or some part of them, some version of them, will be trapped here in this weird pocket dimension of the Round Table Hold, so that they can access Limveld, which is also kind of in its own pocket dimension. There's a reason that it's not part of the continent of the Lands Between anymore, right? It's separated by itself. They'll be able to access Limveld and defeat the Night Lords, defeat the Night Aspect, and push back the Night. And the whole point of this is to restore the Erd Tree, because the Erd Tree does not exist anymore. Whether that means it is destroyed, or whether it's simply inaccessible, this is a bit more difficult to say. But I'll get to that in a second as well. So first, about the characters. So Wilder, he's part of this sort of nomadic tribe. And again, here's all the spoilers for all the character stories, so fair warning on that. So his tribe was massacred. Um, and there's something kind of strange because it seems like they all they all chose to fight against the knight. Um, Even though it seems to be because of this whole plan of the cutting gifted tribe. So I'm not really sure what to make of that. Maybe there's something going on about fate and free will, or rather, there definitely is something going on about fate and free will. I don't know if that's relevant to this idea that, for example, Raider, he wanted to find an enemy worthy to fight, and so he wanted to try his hand against the Night Lord. But it seems also that, like, this magical thing that the cutting gifted tribe did is controlling it's that is the reason that these Nightfarers are here. So why they also have their own reasons for being here is a bit more confusing to answer. um Wilder's tribe took in this orphan who is the Duchess, and these are all just names of these people. Don't really remember anything. At least the versions in the Round Table hold. Uh, this branch of that person, they don't remember anything. So all of these names are just descriptions of what they do. The Wilder is, he wilds, he goes crazy. Guardian guards. Iron Eye's, he's got a good eye for hitting people with arrows. Duchess, I don't. We'll get to that in a second, but basically these are just descriptions. So that they have real names that we don't really know about, except for well, we know that Raider also had another name, which was Black Claw. We know that Revenant is the doll called Daphne, um, who is sort of partially imbued with the spirit of um, her owner, Chloe. But beyond that, we don't have a name for anyone. So, Wilder's clan, they took in this orphan Duchess who has some background as a thief. Um, Now, why she's a Duchess? Because there is something odd about, Wilder. Wilder has this. Let's just look at him for a second. Wilder's kind of clothing is. This makes sense for a kind of nomadic tribe. There isn't, timeline wise, if we were to kind of come up with an analog to real world history, we're looking at something vaguely medieval. This is 11th century, 12th century, whatever, something along those lines. I mean, it's very finely decorated, but that's like most of the Elden Ring armor. It doesn't look too. It doesn't look too late in the timeline, but when we look at Duchess, we see that she. Oh, whoops! I have the black leather on. She's wearing garb that really looks a bit later in style. She's got the cravat. Um, Something more like, late Renaissance, maybe even Victorian era. Um, so it's not impossible that these things could exist side by side, but it's also possible that the fact that they adopted her, um, we could also have a multiple different timeline kind of thing going on with this, because Duchess is sort of special in that she was born an orphan because her mother could not give birth until she killed herself, and because she was corrupted by the night. So Duchess was born after the night was already encroaching, which means that this whole thing with the ambiguity between worlds already kind of exists because the night is washing in. And so and this is probably the reason that Duchess is sort of picked as the priestess, because she has this affinity to the night. Um, but it could also be that her adoption by Wilder's clan involved, it wasn't just like some neighboring person. In other words, what I'm imagining is something along the lines of, I'm going to go back to my pictures. Um, 1 second. So what we could have had happen is something like this. Here's Wilder. That's his helmet. There's his little thingy on his. This is great sword. This is Wilder. Okay, so Wilder, and here's his clan. Okay, here's Duchess. She's green, just to make it clear. There's Duchess. And Duchess is born from this mother who is infected by the night. That's the night. Okay, so the night sort of corrupts the mother. She has to kill herself in order to birth Duchess. And then Duchess gets adopted by Wilder's clan. This could be actually from a different world, so that this is one reality and this is another reality. There's not really that much evidence to suggest this, except for the fact that they are wearing garb from sort of different eras, and the fact that this involves the night. This whole, Duchess's birth involves the night. So that is a possibility I just wanted to bring up. Okay, so back to the characters. Okay, so now we have where are we? We have Guardian. Guardian's story is not that relevant to he's part of this great flock of pinion folk, these like bird people. They're constantly at war. They're sort of noble warriors. And he failed to defend his people because of this Ictaris weapon, which struck the pinion folk from the sky. It stopped them from being able to fly. And so that just absolutely destroyed them. It turns out that this Ictaris weapon was created using a brooch imbued with magic that the Recluse created. And she didn't intend it. She intended to use it to quell storms, but instead it was sort of repurposed as this weapon against the pinion folk. So, that's a sad story. Okay. Iron Eye is part of a league of assassins who are all those who live in death. And they have been revived from death specifically to be assassins. We'll get to that in a second. Raider is a pirate. There are these two different pirates who are who have this rivalry, Black Claw and White Horn, the eastern and western seas. They're fighting each other. Well, they're sort of. It's not really clear if they're fighting each other or not. But they have this rivalry, and so they want to fight each other. And then what happens is Raider goes to this tourney of the lands between, which is again a kind of pocket dimension, even from the Round Table Hold pocket dimension. So we've got multiple different layers of multiple realities going on. So this tourney of the lands between allows him to fight White Horn. because it turns out that even though he's got this Whitehorn helmet, he is actually Black Claw, because the two of them exchanged their sort of their totems, their fetishes. Uh, Whitehorn gave Blackclaw his helmet, and Blackclaw gave Whitehorn his necklace, and this way, they would have a great fight, and whoever won would sort of take their thing back. And so Raider, who is Blackclaw, gets to finally fight Whitehorn, and sort of sets the Whitehorn on a tombstone to honor his dead rival and friend, and takes his necklace back. I think there is also a possibility that Whitehorn and Blackclaw are actually also the same person. See, the thing is with all these characters, one of the questions that I've always been asking myself about the base game of Elden Ring is what the heck is going on with all this identity stuff? Because, of course, there's the big one, which is Radigan and Marika, but then there's all this other stuff, Melania and Millicent and her sisters, there's Mikola and Saint Trina, there's the D twins, there's, Horalu and Sarosh and Godfrey, there's Margit and Morgott, and there's Malekith exists in one place and another. There's all of these different things going on with weirdness of identities. And to my surprise and great pleasure, this continues in Elden Ring Nightreign, so we get a bit more context for what is going on here. And each of these character stories deals with this exact same theme of identity and what is going on with identity. So I'll explain how that all factors in a second, but let's just move on for now. Revenant, so we have this, again, from a different kind of timeline, almost a different time period. This is something much more sort of Victorian era, with the Northern-Croft family. And you have Chloe Northern-Croft. The night comes in, and it infects this person who then murders the family in this vicious attack, and murders Chloe, the daughter. And in her dying moments, she reaches out to the doll that she caressed. She had this, the family was known for being able to create these beautiful dolls, and she had this doll of her own, who she called Daphne. The doll was just a doll, but in that moment, her sort of will, her blood, her lifeblood, her will, kind of activates the doll, and the doll, it's sort of a combination of things, because it is both the dying of Chloe and the fact that Daphne supposedly kind of sees Chloe dying and wants to take vengeance, that brings the doll to life. We'll come back to that for a second. So Recluse, she's one of the witches of the deep forest. She gave birth to this creature called the Gnawling, which had incredible power. And so it was then used, she facilitated its use as a weapon, sort of not realizing until the end of her journey that all she really needed to do was treat it like a child and be maternal towards it, which is a theme that applies to Elden Ring as well. Executor is a bit more complicated, and this will be a good way into the whole identity thing. So Executor is several people. So there is a guy from the Land of Reeds who travels to the Lands Between and becomes a Crucible Knight. He is sent to execute this painter who is painting a picture of the Erd Tree. It's a bit unclear what's going on here, because there's a, we're not really given any we're not really given any clear, explicit information here. But what it seems to me like is you have this guy from the Land of Reeds who is sent to the, or who arrives in the Lands Between, becomes a Crucible Knight, is sent to execute this painter. He lets the painter finish the painting, or he's going to. I'm not totally clear on this, but in any case, he kills the painter, and in that act, and then he kills himself. And because of that, they sort of become one person. So there's a reason why people thought Executor was a girl, and why he has, for example, the Uria of Londor, uh, additional garb, because he is sort of both of these people. He is this Crucible Knight, and he is also the painter at the same time. He is the Executor and the painter. Both of them are kind of in this one body, and this is sort of this theme that goes with all of these characters, is these two different personas in one person. With Recluse, it is the Witch of the Wheel, and this sort of the shadow of herself. With Revenant, it is Daphne and Chloe. With Raider, it's Blackclaw, Whitehorn. With Duchess, it's the Thief and the Priestess, and they even talk in a different way. So they're sort of different personas. With Iron Eye, it's this other self that he kills. With Guardian, it's not. There isn't really an identity thing going on. I mean, it's a bit more down to earth in that his identity is just sort of accepting his role as guardian of this new flock of Nightfarers. And with Wilder, it is becoming the Night Lord himself. So at the end of Wilder's quest, he gets a silver tear from Noclatio to essentially become the new Night Lord. And this is where things get a little bit confusing to me, because I think one very plausible possibility for what is happening in this whole thing, there are these references to, for example, the Iron Menial sort of encounters the Night Lord in a dream, and he's given this message, he's given this thing. There's these references to a formless master, someone that is sort of facilitating this whole plan. And now this obviously relates to the Cutting Gifted tribe, but I think we already know from Recluse's quest that her child, the Gnawling, kind of merged with Hellstor, the Night Lord. And then we get in Wilder's ending, he becomes the Night Lord, but he just looks like Hellstor. He's not just Wilder as a Night Lord, right? He is like Hellstor now. And I think there's a very real possibility that Wilder is already sort of Hellstor, and that he is manipulating certain things, that he is communicating with the Iron Menial, for example, like in a weird timeline kind of thing going on. And that he may be the formless master, because the Night Lord is multiple people. So that's a bit weird, but I think that that's a real possibility, that he is... Hellstor was a real person, but just like the Executor is now the Executor and the Painter together, I think the Night Lord that we actually fight may already be Wilder, if that makes sense. So does Executor's backstory imply that it's considered a sin to create graven images of the Erd Tree in the Golden Order? I don't know that there's anything about it being a sin. Oops. So Is Hellstar also the giant tree guy though? That is where I'm coming to next. So, do you think the Formless Master is the mummy guy at the end? So, okay, so there's this thing about the cutting gifted tribe. Where is it? No, it isn't here, isn't it? Oh yeah, here we go. Okay, so this is the description for the Primordial Night Lord's rune. It says the cutting gifted tribe anticipated the coming night and spent many a moon planning its prevention, concluding that their only chance at success was to cheat a god. They had glimpsed what they should not, the very sin of the Erd Tree. For their trespass, so were they punished. So, first of all, the cutting gifted tribe, the cutting refers to basically cuttage. So, we've had all this stuff in the base game about grafting, which in horticulture is, if you actually knew someone who used to do this, if you have, let's say, like an avocado tree and a lemon tree, you can take a piece of the, I don't remember which way it goes, but maybe both ways. But let's say the lemon tree, and if you make a little sort of, you cut off a little bit of the branch of the avocado tree and sort of stick them together and tie it all up, and you have the right conditions, then they will actually merge, and you will have grafted this new lemon tree part onto the avocado. And people actually do this quite a bit because certain types of trees are hardier. So if you want to, let's say, grow some type of fruit, but in the area that you're in, it's really arid and it's difficult to grow that type of fruit, or it just won't grow that well. You can graft it onto a tree that is hardier, and that way you can have a lemon tree with all of the hardiness of an avocado tree, or whatever the two trees might be. So that's grafting. Cuttage is, I think, basically just when you sort of take off a piece of one tree and use it to create a completely new tree. So you're not really grafting it onto an existing tree, you're just sort of growing another tree from that cutting. So, and in the Japanese for this, the gifted part is not really there. It's just referring to this sort of horticulture thing. So they anticipated the coming night and spent many a moon planning its prevention, concluding that their only chance at success was to cheat a god. So, how did they anticipate the night? So, here we need to look at the Night Lords, the description for each of them. So, first of all, the fact that you have these multiple Night Lords, they don't all have the same path to becoming Night Lord, right? So, as far as Adele is concerned, right, there's some island that has a bunch of different types of life, and Adele is just this crazy dragon that exists there, and he just eats everything. He's the apex predator, right? Um, and then the night washes in, and it kind of destroys all of the life, all of the other life, except for Adele. So why does that happen? I think basically because the night is this sort of formless chaos, right? The night rain, it drains your health, and it sort of wears things away. And so we see at the ending arena with all these night lords, it's just desert, it's just sand, right? Even when the round table hold is there, there's just nothing left. And this is a sort of metaphor that we've seen in previous Souls games as well. For example, the very end of the Ringed City, it's like the end of time. Everything has just been worn down to nothing because that's entropy. Things just are worn down. And so this is the result of the night. It just it sort of like the frenzied flame, it just turns everything into ash, into dust, into nothingness. So with Adele, there's this big island, apex predator on an island. The night comes in and it just destroys all of the life, right? It just wears down all of the life there, except for Adele. So Adele is strong enough to be able to resist this, but all of the other sort of weaker life forms, the prey there, they're just destroyed, and so Adele has nothing left to eat. And so this, I think, tells us sort of how a Night Lord works. On a Night Lord, it's just purely about power. It's about the amount of power that you have. If you have enough power, if you have enough vitality within you from consuming others and from being able to arrest power for yourself, then you can survive the night and you can become a Night Lord, essentially, because you're powerful enough to sort of remain whole and not be washed away by this torrent. Um, in the case of honestly, I don't really know what's going on with Noster. The secluded forest was being eaten away by the surrounding desert, and when the blessing of water passed over its many leaves and boughs, thus began a great exodus of its creatures. Then we have Caligo, who very interestingly is feminine. And there is, I think, fairly good evidence that Caligo was cut from the base game of Elden Ring. Um, I saw something about basically looking at some of the IDs in the data, and a sort of texture file that corresponded to Caligo. It was very convincing to me, at least. So, one possibility is that this might be the consort of Placidusax. Well, before that, I should say this does help clarify one thing, which is that when we look at in the base game, and this is partly why I'm inclined to sort of start treating some of this as relevant to the base game. When we look at the base game, there was this question of the fire giants drove the ice drakes, the ice dragons, from the peak of the mountaintops of the giants. And because the only ice dragon that we know of was Borealis, people assumed that this must have happened after, Baal existed and after this whole thing, after the drakes were born. And I don't think that's obvious now, because we have this dragon which is clearly much more like an ancient dragon than a drake, who is an ice dragon. So I think I think that at least opens the possibility that this whole thing with the fire giants driving the dragons from the peak happened before we had generally thought. So that could have happened very, very early on. And so the fire giants could have been residents of the mountaintop peak for a very long time, which I think makes a bit more sense with the timeline of the Giant's Forge, because it's hard to imagine that there are certain questions, depending on what sort of line of inquiry you're pursuing, regarding what the forge was used for. This is something I've been thinking about a lot, and how that would relate to Placidusax being Elden Lord. That I think this at least opens the door to explain things in a different way. The idea of her maybe being Placidusax's consort is a whole nother thing, but we do have Placidusax as Elden Lord, and we don't have a consort for him. So some people have said Caligo sure seems similar to the ancient dragons of fog from Dark Souls 1. Yeah. I don't really see that it needs to be that. As far as the Dark Souls stuff goes, I think there's two ways you can look at this. So the first way is sort of the easy way out, which is, why do Gaping Dragon appear? Why is the Nameless King here? The easy way is, in this universe, in this multiverse, um, there is a guy called the Nameless King who rides a drake, and he comes from right. So all of these bosses, right, they're drawn in by the night because the night is this sort of potential between worlds. So it's opening up these different pathways, these different realities. So all of these bosses, I mean, not just the Dark Souls ones, but also whatever the demi-human queen and all of these things that are appearing. Um, so the easy way to explain the Dark Souls stuff is Dark Souls is not part of this multiverse. In this multiverse, in this universe of Elden Ring, there is a character called the Nameless King who rides a drake who has been drawn in. And this is not the same character as the one from Dark Souls because these are just separate worlds. There's a gaping dragon. It happens to have the same name and it looks like the thing from Dark Souls, but this does not mean that the worlds are connected. This is just a separate thing that exists in the multiverse of Elden Ring, and maybe it has a completely different backstory. That's a bit boring. So I actually prefer the explanation that yes, this is actually a multiverse. The Dark Souls is connected, but that's not really that relevant to the plot. We don't really need to bring anything to bear from Dark Souls um onto Elden Ring. And one piece of evidence that I would just bring up here is, I think it is, let's see, is it this? What is it? It's something to do with Recluse. Hold on, let me find it real quick. Oh, maybe it's the staff. Is that it? Yeah, so the Recluse's staff says, um, a staff bound in red drenched laurels that curses foes serves as a catalyst for sorceries. The laurels, imbued with a blood rite, unlock the peculiar fields of magic that flow through a given region. In the lands between, the staff invokes the strength of glintstones. So there's an implication here that, like, this whole system of glintstone magic that exists in the lands between, this is something that is purely the purview of the lands between. That somewhere else, there might be a whole different system of magic. And I think this kind of is very relevant for understanding the whole multiple reality thing going on because even if we say that, let's say, Nameless King in Nightreign is Nameless King from Dark Souls, I don't think that means that anything that we know about Dark Souls, what we do know, has any bearing on Elden Ring because we're just dealing with a different reality that's going on. So the fact that Nameless King has somehow managed to enter this reality through the night, um, it doesn't mean that we get to say, oh, well, actually, um, the let's say the first flame, like the Giant's Forge has the first flame. No, I think these are separate things. The Giant's Forge has its own system going on. The Lands Between has its own system going on that does not relate to Dark Souls, even though they're very similar, obviously. Um, but I think it's I think this staff description gives us a way out of that problem. Um, Now, there still is the issue of, for example, could an unnamed character in Elden Ring actually be a Dark Souls character? Could this have been planned from the beginning, this multiverse? And that is something which I think is very. Uh, there's a lot of reasons to not want to go down that route, but, if we consider it, we do have this Storm Lord. Um, we don't know. Now, I still think the most likely answer to the Stormlord is Placidusax, and I think there's good supporting evidence for that. But could it actually be the Nameless King or his Drake, who in Dark Souls 3 was called the Storm? I can't remember if it's Storm Lord or Storm King. Of course, there's also the Storm King from Demon Souls, but that doesn't seem to be a part of this world because that is a separate IP. So, is that possible? I mean, you can go that route if you want. If you want to say that the Glowmide Queen is Ivelka, you have a pathway to say that. I don't think it's worth really pursuing that too much. Um, I don't see any evidence from the base game that this was planned, and I think the simplest explanation here is, of course, that um, this stems from providing narrative context. Again, like I explained before, providing narrative context to game contrivances. The contrivance is that Ishizaki and the team for Nightreign wanted to bring back some of these bosses that they probably personally worked on in Dark Souls 1 and 2 and 3. And they wanted to bring those back. And so here's a way to do that. The night, this formless chaos, things can come out of it. Great. So now any of the IPs that you own with all of these bosses and stuff, you can bring anything back because this is just the boundaries between worlds. So just as with, I would say, Michael Moorcock's multiverse, if you read those stories, most of them, they're totally independent stories. So even though there's this broader thing of, there's the multiverse and the Eternal Champion is the same person across time, usually what happens is that they don't really remember any of their other lives. Now, occasionally they do, but for example, the Eternal Champion, the story that started the whole multiverse concept within his output, it starts with this opening of him being John Dacre, who's a character that he wrote many stories about. And then John Dacre sort of has this weird dream, and he wakes up in this crypt as the hero Arakosa, and he almost immediately forgets everything about his life as John Dacre. So there's this sort of implication, okay, it's the same person, he's in a different universe, but now the whole story that happens here is about Arakosa and what's going on there. So I think we have a kind of similar situation where there is a multiverse. Dark Souls is probably just, it is part of the broader multiverse of what's going on. It's another one of these bubbles that exists, and with its own multiple bubbles and convoluted time going on, but it doesn't really have any bearing on the story of Elden Ring. I always thought it was weird how Nameless King said, "I'll see you in Nightreign" when you beat him in DS3. Yeah. Okay, so where were we? Yes, with the looking at the relics. So Caligo. So Maris. One thought which I've had is that obviously Maris looks very similar in concept to the Elden Beast. Um, oh, and I mentioned earlier there were two sources of influence I wanted to point to for some kind of way to understand why I'm coming to some of these ideas. One was the whole Eternal Champion series. The other is Attack on Titan, which has a lot of visual similarities. Um, Specifically, of course, the rumbling, um, and also the Elden Beast itself, which is very, very similar in design to the. I knew John was going to boo that. Very similar in design to the creature in Attack on Titan, which sort of infects Ymir, and of course there's a giant tree and weird timeline stuff going on. So um, it's possible that that the Elden Beast is basically a kind of Maris, because there's this thing about it. It camouflages with its surroundings. It creates an ocean of its surroundings and then camouflages. So if some type of Maris creature sort of merged with tree life, um, maybe that camouflage would basically become something that looks like an Elden Beast. It's not a crazy idea. Now we're told that the Elden Beast is the living incarnation of the concept of order, and that it was sent by the greater will. Still don't really know what either of those things mean. So I think this is a very, very plausible possibility that the Elden Beast is actually, let's say, a Maris creature or Maris itself, maybe a different version of Maris if there's only one of these. There's probably multiple because we're just dealing with grand macrocosmic scales here. So it's a little bit this the design similarity and then the fact that it's talks about camouflage. We don't really see it camouflage in game. So this thing about camouflage, that could be a very direct reference to the Elden Beast. Still have my question of you think if the land of reeds and other lands that aren't the lands between are different worlds / universes. I would go back to what I said about, for example, Yggdrasil and the different Norse realms with Midgard and Jotunheim and Asgard. You can travel physically from Midgard to Jotunheim. You can go to the mountains and literally go there. Even though they're different sort of realms. So to get from Asgard to Midgard, you got to take Brisingamer. You have to take the Rainbow Bridge. So they're almost sort of separate places, but there's also kind of a physical connection. So I think basically when you sail the seas, you are in a liminal place. So, you can imagine in this universe, let's say the Land of Reeds, maybe there's a little island just off the coast of the Land of Reeds. Okay. Well, it's in the same general vicinity. That's probably its own location. Although, if we had a game set in the Land of Reeds, I bet that if you had a little island off to the coast, that there would be something slightly off about that island, that it wouldn't be exactly in the same kind of, it would be something that you can physically travel to, but also it's not exactly there in the same place. For example, in the Lands Between, we have the isolated Divine Tower, which is clearly just part of the Lands Between. You could imagine swimming there, or jumping off the mountaintops and swimming to this little isolated Divine Tower. But at the isolated Divine Tower, suddenly you can see this giant Farum Azula in the sky, which you can't see anywhere else. So there are these places that the physical, I don't think there's a sharp distinction, to answer your question, a sharp distinction between different world / different reality / different universe and another physical location, especially when we're talking about places on the sea. The sea is this divide that things don't necessarily, you're traveling in the physical world, on a boat, but you're also traveling something else. There's something liminal about this space. If you look down into the chasms that surround the Nightmare Frontier, you'll notice that there are wrecked sea ships. Yes, 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 and um, wait, now I'm mixing up which is the Nightmare Frontier. Uh, there's like the DLC location, and then there's the one that you go to with the amygdala, right? So the amygdala one, you can see all these ships out in the distance, and then in the DLC location, if you look down into the water, like where Kos is, you can see the ships below. So it's like this layer of reality, which is a very similar concept, I think, to Metyr, who is sort of below the water, and I think in a way might be even sort of below the arena of the Elden Beast. Um, that there's something, it's sort of like connected but a different layer, if that makes sense. The fact that there are these giant stone coffins in the Land of Shadow also supports your idea of the ocean representing the limits of the universe. Yes. Yeah. Are trees meant to grow atop the divine towers? Isn't that what happens in Nightreign? Yes, I think that is one thing where I'm pretty comfortable applying Nightreign's lore to the base game. Um, for multiple reasons. One being that there was always this slightly ambiguous or this unanswered question, let's say, about what was going on with the Divine Towers. Why do they have this stuff on the outside? It looks like petrified rock. It's like rock or lava or something. They've got this crap on the outside. No one had a good explanation for. There was this whole lava flow theory, which has some, there's something to it, but I don't think I believe it. Um, but I think the idea that these were formerly trees, um, I mean, it fits with a lot of what we already know, um, thematically at least. And it's such a specific idea. There's no reason why Night had to make them divine towers. You could have had, it would have made perfect sense with the story of the game that they wrote and with what you're trying to convey, and as a visual signifier to just have a tree. You don't need to have it be surrounding a giant a divine tower unless that was something already part of the lore. So I feel pretty comfortable applying that to the base game. Yes, the tower in Night it has hands, and this is something that we actually see in Shadow of the Erd Tree. If I can find it. So let's see. Um, no, that's not it. Hold on, give me 1 second here. This is the concept art. I may not be able to see it that well, but I don't have just a normal picture of the. It's a bit clear, maybe somewhere else. So if you look here at this image, this is the spiral tree seal sigil, and here we have these winding branches. Again, a caduceus symbol, the winding branches surrounding this thing, which has two hands reaching up. So this is a symbol that we already saw in the DLC. And considering also that the DLC and Nightreign were in development at the same time, this is probably a concept that already existed in the lore, was not stolen from the DLC, because um, I can't imagine that they independently came up with this on their own. I think it's probably that was intentional. Um, does that then mean that the divine towers were put in the lands between as a sort of world garden? So this gets then to the cutting gifted tribe. Now, I don't have a good way of accessing the secret in the ravine in Limfeld. Um, but so for those who don't know or haven't seen, there's an extremely rare item that drops in the churches, perhaps somewhere else as well, but as far as I know, it's only in the churches, called the cord end. And if you get the cord end, you can go to the secret door in the ravine next to the central castle. You can find the door in any run. You just can't open it. It says it won't open for those who don't have merit. If you find the cord end, you can open this door, and I think the cord end has something ridiculous like a 0.01% chance of dropping or something like that. So if you get the cord end, you can open this door, and inside, I'll find a picture of it. So give me 1 second. Inside, um, let's see. There is this girl. Someone's got to have a picture of it, right? Um, Hold on. Give me 1 second here to find it. Okay, so let's bring this back over here. And so 0.035%. Yeah, okay, amazing. So if you get the cord end, you can go to this doorway and open it up. And at the end of this long hallway is this. Oh, come on. Ridiculous. So there's you posted a picture on Frenzied? Oh, okay. Let me bring that up so that I have a good picture. Hold on. Not seeing the picture, but maybe it's just further up. Uh-huh. Hold on. Okay, there's a picture. One second here. So, okay. Let's. So, in this, you see this girl. Her hands are tied together, and this is very, very evocative because it looks very similar to something else, which is. Oh man, do I have a picture of it? Hold on. I'm gonna have to bring up another picture now. Hold on. Um, give me 1 second here to find this. So I know I have a good picture of it. Got it on my phone, so I just need to put it on the computer. And I have so many memes on here. Okay. All right. So where are we now? Okay. All right. So first of all, this is the Mikola statue from what is it called? Ordina. I just wanted to bring that up because it is kind of similar, but really what I'm looking at is this one. And this is very, very, very similar. Literally in fact, I would go as far to say that we're probably dealing with the same asset. You can see the fingers are even in the same exact position. So this is the statue that, I mean, obviously they edited it because now she's wearing like a hood, um, and she's got this thing tied together. But you can see that the hands, the pinky turned that way. It's exactly the same. So what does this mean? So first of all, what is this? This picture. So if we look at um, let me look up cutting gifted tribe. Okay, so this is the description for the cord end. It says this cord belonged to the young girls who were housed in a place that was meant as an eternal secret. The cutting gifted tribe vowed to sacrifice their flesh while concealing the truth. But the girls were too young to oblige. So this cutting gifted tribe, first of all, they are clearly responsible, according to um, the Night Lord's rune. They are clearly responsible for this whole plan with the Nightfarers. So what is going on there? Cutting Gifted, they're the ones who created this whole system, who created this roundtable hold, and I think is likely in the normal ending for Nightreign, who you give the Night Lord's rune to. you're sort of giving it to some member of the Cutting Gifted tribe who is accepting the Night Lord's rune as an act of atonement. Um, so, what is going on with the girls here? This is where I'm less sure about what's going on. This line about they vowed to sacrifice their flesh while concealing the truth, but the girls were too young to oblige. So they were too young to sacrifice their flesh. The fact that they're too young to oblige makes it sound like it might have something to do with giving birth, which is obviously a major theme in the base game. And as far as Nightreign is concerned, there's something odd about Recluse's story in that she literally gives birth to the Night Lord, or something that then becomes the Night Lord. So maybe, and then you have Duchess's story where she could only be born by her mother killing herself, which sounds kind of relevant to this. So I'm not really sure what is going on there. It sounds as if they messed up somehow. Like, but okay, they vowed to do this, but then this happened. So if we're following the Cutting Gifted tribe's plan, then maybe the mess up, maybe the mistake was allowing the night to happen in the first place, which means that maybe this is the reason the night is taking place, that they didn't sacrifice their flesh, these young girls. And then obviously this has something to do with Marika, because you find the court end in Marika's churches, and it resembles this statue, who I think is either, this statue from Farah Missoula is either Marika or something very, very related to Marika, because, we find it, Malekith is guarding it, surrounded by wolves. Wolves are the shadows of Empyreans. It's underneath the Elden Ring. So, and then this all has to do with the sin of the Erd Tree. And of course, then the DLC talks a lot about original sin, and Mikola is trying to bury their original sin. Mesmer is keeping company with the original sin. So, what exactly is going on here? This is where I don't really have a good answer yet. But it is actually, I feel it's nice to get something new to think about, because I have been on this train of thought before about what's going on with maidens. Why do you sacrifice maidens? Why is a maiden kindling for the Giant's Forge? What is going on with the Giant's Forge, the trees, the Divine Towers, the Erd Tree? What is the original sin? So this is all sort of stuff that I've been trying to figure out already, and now we have a little bit more context for it. And as far as the Cutting Gifted tribe goes, the idea that they are Newman, I think, is pretty unambiguous as far as I can tell, because there's clearly something going on with tree people. So, just as the shamans have this ability to melt, their flesh melds harmoniously and they become trees. I think that clearly connects to the Cutting Gifted tribe. Whether that means that they are the sort of original Newman or some split off part of them, somehow related to the Nox, I think that's a bit more difficult to understand, but definitely Newman, I think. I don't know about Shaman. I would just say Newman. I think the Shaman are Newman, but the Shaman seems specifically to have to do with what they're doing, right? Shaman is a job title rather than an ethnicity. And then, of course, the biggest part of all of this, which remains unanswered, is this guy. Like, who is this? What's happening here? Um, Let me go back to maybe there we go. So we have this final ending cutscene where we see suddenly the lands between is restored to its former glory. The Erd Tree is back. And well, and first before this, what happens? So we give the this guy, oh well, this is Iron Eye's ending, isn't it? Oh yeah, okay. So we give this guy the Night Lord's rune. And then the rune disappears. We walk away, and then we sort of turn into Grace. And the Grace sort of goes around. It comes back to the round table. And so it's implied that something about this action, so we've sort of atoned for our sins as the condemned, on behalf of the cutting gifted tribe, let's say. And in that act of atonement, this grace returns to the round table, which is then connected to the restoral of the Erd Tree, because we've turned back the night. And then a little fallen leaf from the Erd Tree falls and touches, very similar to the very opening of the base game in which we're touched by grace. This sort of revives this giant. And we see him wake up. Of course, he's made entirely of sort of tree stuff. Although there are these odd little swirly patterns on him. Which, I don't know if we can see any better. Yeah, sort of there. It's hard to see here. Yeah, there you can see just on the edge of his leg, these sort of fingerprint swirl spiral patterns, which is very interesting. Yeah, that's a better shot. So, what's going on there? And in fact, it may be that he's actually made out of metal, and the tree roots are just sort of surrounding this. So who's that guy? He just walks away into the distance. So there's I think two interpretations of what this guy is that I find compelling, and they're totally opposite. So I'm still not really sure about this. So one interpretation is that this is the night, a literal manifestation of the night, because of course as we make our way through Limveld, as the night advances, we start to see these guys take form. And there's multiples, right? And so they're all kind of going through the marching through, and of course there is a this is part of what is definitely feels like an Attack on Titan reference. um so then by restoring the Erd Tree, by fending off the night, then okay, that fends him off, he goes away. That would paint him as sort of a more villainous figure. And we do have this line in the game from about how no, where is it? Hold on. Oh, it's the expeditions, isn't it? So it says, beyond the boundless night, there lies a hazy figure of a person. That is the night's origin, an enemy to the world. Oh, wait, no. Where is it? Uh, Where am I? Ah, yeah. So the trace of night. Um, this says that the light dimly reveals the contours of a greater being that lies beyond the Night Lord. Now, this could just be referring to Helster, because you get these from the other bosses. I don't think you get one from Helster. I'll have to check that actually. But it could also imply that, just like with pretty much anything in this world, right? If you have power, you have a patron who is who you are accessing for that power, some kind of divine entity. So it could be that the knight itself that you're dealing with, um, something like a kind of uh, knight patron entity in this guy, and that there's multiple versions of him or whatever. Now, the other compelling theory to me is that this is actually a supposedly friendly character, and that this has something to do with the cutting gifted tribe in the Newman. And that him walking away here is basically saying, "All right, my work is done, and I'm going because the Erd Tree has been restored." Um, I don't really know what to make of it more than that. Uh, Beyond the fact that I think, you know, just as a at the basic level with Elden Ring, like trees represent order. You know, the Erd tree represents order, but also just a tree represents order. This was the initial metaphor that Miyazaki came up with, because a tree can be something that is, strong and powerful, and um, unites life under it, but it is impermanent because order. There's always entropy. I'm paraphrasing him, by the way. So you could imagine the greater will, um, wanting to just plant as many trees as possible because that is order. You are seeding the universe with this order of life to fight against the chaos of the night, which is sort of this potential. And this ties into, there's a lot of stuff to do with fate here, where because of the potential of the night, you can kind of, I think the idea is you can kind of determine your own fate because there's all these possibilities open up in the darkness. Whereas, which also is very similar, I think, to how the dark is sort of works in Dark Souls. Um, but you can imagine that the greater will just wants to seed the universe with these trees, which would then, like the lands between, kind of anchor the world and determine its order. It would define it. These trees of light. And so these giants, this giant and his fellow aspects in the that you see in Limveld, could be emissaries of the greater will, or it could even be the greater will itself. If you imagine that these are some kind of mycelium network tree hive mind fingerprint giant swarm of people, that they are the greater will. um, Now, I don't know if I want to go there because I feel like the greater will is generally has more to do with space than he does with, I don't know, whatever this is, and also the fact that they're touched by fingerprints. That feels more like a secondary level of being rather than some higher level. But um, the idea that these could be a greater will aligned, thing, I think is not crazy. I'd like that because the Greater Will just being really giant dudes would be very funny and mundane. Um, yeah, I think I mean, obviously, so I haven't read all of A Song of Ice and Fire. In fact, I never even finished the first book. I have been meaning to get back to that, but I do know a little bit about what goes on in there. And there's this whole concept of green seers, um, and the weirwood network, where the sort of the consciousness of multiple people can be conjoined through this system of trees, and this even can transcend time itself. And I think what you might have going on with Elden Ring is that a similar kind of thing. I imagine it from this perspective. Um, let's say you've got these two forces in the universe or in the multiverse of order and chaos, and each is just fighting for dominance. Um, Now, if we say chaos is can be symbolized by sort of, turgid waters, darkness, it's just potential, anything can happen. Well, order, it would make sense for order to be something tree like, because the idea is that you're sort of anchored in place, right? A tree doesn't move, it just, but also you can connect to other trees. And so I sort of imagine, if I go back to, let's see, where was it? Where's my beautiful picture? I'm sort of imagining here that all of these worlds, all of these little bubbles that pop up, you've got a little tree here, here, whatever, here. And so these connections, these roots, reach out to all of these different worlds. And so if you keep on having more and more worlds, and you keep on growing trees in them, and what you've done is you've created a whole system of worlds that are unified, are kind of anchored in place, which is order, as opposed to kind of letting them go their own way and just floating in the formless, you know, waters of chaos and night. So I think the idea of a tree sort of anchoring reality, and that's why they hold memories. That's a key concept, right? The remembrances are carved into the Erd tree, so that it's this way of storing the world as it exists and not letting that be lost and just kind of floating rudderless, right? It's a way of storing things. It stores the memories. It stores the I don't know, the souls, the spirits of the people of that land, and that gives it some definition so that it can't change. Cutting gifted tribe deals in cloning trees. I feel like they've created the tree giant. Yeah, that's definitely possible. Um, I'm still sort of trying to figure out how, if the cutting gifted tribe relates to the divine towers, that connects them then to the Rao, because the Rao definitely created the divine towers, or some offshoot of the Rao did. Um, and there's still, I think, with how much more explicit Night is about the multiverse aspect, the multiple reality aspect, I feel much better about certain things, but it does open up a lot more possibilities for how things worked. For example, the ancient dynasty and these stone coffins. So it might have seemed like a pretty good idea to pursue the idea that these stone coffins were just from like some other island or whatever. But now the idea that they're from literally like a different reality, a different universe, seems much more possible. And then if you can have also recursive realities, so for example, um, if traveling between realities also gives you some kind of uh if they're not necessarily concurrent in the same flow of time, then maybe the Rao people left and then some version of them came back, or like there's all sorts of possibilities for how we could imagine this all goes down. Isn't the hold itself connected to the tower, thinking of how the crypt looks and where the arena actually is? Yeah, I'm not sure. It definitely is obviously meant to convey a, let's travel to the crypt, the same idea, right? This looks very much like both the divine tower and also the place where the young child, the young maiden, is interred. I don't know if it's meant to be like literally the same place. I mean, this place is, first of all, it's outside of any world, right? It's just a little island on the sea, but it also is um the final arena. This is where the Night Lords are, and this is why you're able to access it after beating Hellster, because this is literally the same place. I think, is this what I'm thinking of? There are these like tree trunks that you see in the sea, um, which I think is just, we're sort of separated from everything, um, but I think the idea is this is the same, and I put the same in quotations. This is the same location as where the Night Lords arenas are. We're just sort of separated from it all right now. And by defeating the night, you bring it back into alignment. So again, I think the idea of a tree having roots in multiple places and therefore uniting them, and that working like an anchor to all these different little floating bubbles in a multiverse, but then also of having multiple branches, and so there's different versions of the same thing existing within this one unified concept. I think that's all kind of part of the metaphor of the tree. Whose corpse is it that you can give the rune to? Think he is related to the Iron Menial at all? Um, I don't know if there's much lore to the Iron Menial. I think um, he's just a little guy. Uh, the last thing I wanted to address is who Helster is. So we have this story about, we have this description for Helster. The country lay in ruin. The man who was once was knight had challenged the hero, but he was too was no match. He fell, just another body in a great pile. But eventually he awoke, crawling out from underneath others. Though he had failed to protect anything or anyone, he yet lived, and so he cursed the world. So I think this. I think it's fairly clear. I mean, now there's obviously no explicit answer here, but and yeah, yes, exactly. He is not just one entity. He is certainly Recluse's child as part of him, and potentially already Wilder as part of him. But as far as the man named Helster, um, one way to interpret this is just another random little story, just like we have all these random little stories of like who is Libra. I don't know, he's just some demon guy that, he's a goat, that really likes things being fair. Noster is just a random bug. There's nothing really going on there. Um, I think there is a decent argument to be made that Hellster is the tarnished from the base game. Um, Now, what I mean by that is, I think he is, let's say, a tarnished from the base game for a few reasons. So, number one, he has a moonlight sword, which um, would indicate that he married a carrion, um, because those are given as wedding presents. I think it says. Um, Renala gave Radigan one, and Ronnie gives you one. Now, I don't think this means that Ronnie's ending is canonical. Um, in fact, I think the idea here is that he challenged this hero, which is either Radigan or Godfrey. Now, of course, there's a different interpretation here, which is that this is just a random story that doesn't relate. But I think if we were to relate it, it would make sense for it to be someone like Radigan, let's say. He challenged this hero, but he fails. So he is not Elden Lord. He does not bring on any of the endings. So the ending of Elden Ring's base game is definitely not canonical to Nightreign's timeline. Now, since we have like multiple realities going on, that doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't happen in a sense. Just that it doesn't happen here, right? So this guy, if we assume that he's the tarnished, then he failed. He failed to become Elden Lord. He failed to bring on whatever new age was going to be brought on. And because of that, but the one reason to suppose that he's tarnished is that he was defeated by this hero, but then he still wakes up, right? So you could say maybe he wasn't killed, but the implication seems to be that he came back from death, and we know that this is something that happens to the tarnished. So if he was the tarnished, this means that he failed to become Elden Lord, and because of that, he's sort of taken in by resentment. So Vike's Night Lord equivalent. Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty good analogy. Someone who sort of reached the end, but yeah, rage quit, essentially, and because of that, he curses the world because he just sucked. He just couldn't do it. Um, so yeah, I don't think he is. I don't think Ronnie's ending happened in this timeline, but he could have promised himself to Ronnie. I mean, the way it's phrased, he failed to protect anything or anyone. It makes it sound like he was trying to protect someone. Um, so it's possible that Ronnie died in his timeline. You don't think Ronnie cares about the Noxus Lord of Night, though? It's hard not to relate them very, very closely together. Now, I agree. There's lots of things in Elden Ring that are extremely similar but notably different. All the different types of fire and moons and whatever. Um, so I won't say that Ronnie's ending is what the Nox wanted, but it is very it's hard not to relate them. I mean, she says that, you know, her age will be one of the Chill Knight. Um, she uses the secret relic of the Eternal City. Um, you know, e.g., wears a mirror helm derived from the Nox. Um, you know, everything that she does seems to be in line with what we know about the Nox. She wants to go against the Fingers. The Nox were against the Greater Will. They had a Finger Slayer blade. So the the ultimate ending might be notably different, but I think she's definitely following something very close to what the Nox were trying to do. Um, yeah, so it could be the consort to a Nox. So yeah, that's the other thing to bring up because I believe when you fight Hellstore, if you have not already encountered the Noclatio shifting Earth, I believe that spawns. Now I need to check that out if that was maybe just random because I think that happened for me both on PlayStation and PC. So I believe that is baked in, but I do need to check that. Um, which would imply that perhaps there is something about the Eternal City that relates to Hellstore specifically. Um, and that's another, by the way, another piece of lore which I feel comfortable bringing to bear on the base game. The idea that Noclatio was part of a greater whole and was what was it, buried underground. Um, Maybe it's here in the codex. A lost city that was desolated in a single night and sealed underground, but recently resurfaced. Um, so I think that I feel like okay, if you could say that this is just made up for this game, but I feel like if you do apply this to the base game, that tells us that number one, um, the Eternal Cities were literally sent underground. It was not just the Nox that were banished underground. It was not the ancient dynasty that was sent underground, as I thought for a while, based on a good video by Cosmos. I believe this is evidence that literally the Eternal Cities they existed above ground and they were sealed underground magically, and that this is some weird magic crap going on. And also, I think this implies that all of the Eternal Cities were connected as one city. Um, no, Noclatio, Nokron, Noxtella, um, and the Nameless City under Lendel. I believe these were not separate cities, which helps explain because it says this thing about um, actually it's not here, but where does it say? There's something about it being part of a greater whole. Um, there's a lot of things in the base game that they just talk about the Eternal City, and they're not specific as like, oh, there's a bunch of Eternal Cities. No, no, no. They just talk about the Eternal City. It's always singular, which of course, okay, we're translating from Japanese. Japanese doesn't have a distinction between singular and plural in most cases, um, but I think the idea that there was once one great sort of island spanning, just as we had the Rao ruins and we had the ancient dynasty, that we have the empire of the Nox, so to speak. One giant city that kind of covers the whole map. Um, I think there's something very attractive about that idea. Is Moonlight Sword the Dark Moon Greatsword of Rani? Well, sure, I've seen some. No, I don't think it's Rani's Greatsword. At least not the one that we get. Noclatio vaguely fits the chunk of missing lower Lendel or something like that. I mean, I don't know about that. It is a semicircle. I, beyond that, I don't really buy trying to put it together there. We already have that missing chunk fits with the nameless Eternal City, so I don't know why you'd put in another Eternal City on top of that. Um, I think and then also you see behind the semicircle there's all these buildings in the water that are like have collapsed. So clearly Noclatio was much bigger than just this semicircle. So if you were trying to fit it together, you have to take that into account, which means that it doesn't fit. So you're saying that the Eternal City was fractured. Yeah, and this kind of ties in with something that I've been thinking about for a while, which is the Black Moon of Noxtella. The Black Moon was the guide of countless stars, and then it shattered because we have these memory stones, these fragments. And so the fact that it had memory in it, it almost works like the Erd Tree. It's like a parallel to the Erd Tree. It's this thing that guides and it has stores memory. And so I've sort of been playing with the idea that before the era of the Elden Ring, that you had this era of night in which the analog for the Elden Ring and the Erd Tree was the Black Moon. Um, and then that was destroyed probably by a meteor impact or a meteor shower, which then sort of, you know, the Nox basically were punished for their for going against the greater will, for their treason actually. So they once were aligned with the greater will, and then perhaps that was the golden stars which brought the Elden Beast. That's sort of the idea that I've been playing with, but I need to think about that some more. Yeah, and the idea that there was a prior um, event which was an analog to the Shattering. We already have a prior internecine war as a parallel to the Shattering War in terms of Baal versus Placidusax. And of course, cycles, this is a common theme in FromSoft games, um, and of course, and the different layers, the different strata of historical time periods, all kind of repeating the same mistakes. So the idea that we could have even had multiple different things going on here, like perhaps a Rao era of night, which is then, um, you know, sort of turned back by the dragons, and then the Nox bringing in another night, which is then turned back by the Erd Tree, and I mean, who knows? It all depends on how you put the events together, but I think it's very possible. Um, yeah, what I said is possible. Okay, well, I think that's everything I wanted to cover, and I do need to go eat some food, so I'm gonna do that. Um, and thank you all for popping in. Um, the link to the Discord server is in the description for this video, if you're not already a part of it, and you can join to continue the conversation there. Otherwise, I need to go do something different so that my brain doesn't get destroyed. All right. Thanks for popping in, everyone, and I will talk to you later.